At the end of a long evening following a company event, Sarah found herself gathering her belongings slowly, her mind preoccupied with the project deadlines looming ahead. As she was about to call for a taxi, her boss, Mr. Thomas, approached her, offering a ride home. "It's quite late and cabs can be hard to find around here at this hour," he said, his tone casual but insistent. Grateful, yet slightly hesitant, Sarah accepted, mindful of the late hour and the lack of convenient transportation options. As they walked to the car, their conversation revolved around the day's event and general work topics. Mr. Thomas talked about the future of the company and the upcoming projects he envisioned Sarah taking a lead on. Initially, she felt at ease discussing her career aspirations and the new ideas she hoped to implement. Mr. Thomas seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, nodding and encouraging her to take initiative. However, as they drove away from the brightly lit city center towards the quieter, darker streets leading to her home, the atmosphere in the car shifted subtly. Mr. Thomas began to comment on how nice Sarah looked at the event, his words initially seeming like harmless compliments. Gradually, his comments became more personal and less appropriate. "You always dress so sharply, Sarah. It's quite fetching. It must be turning quite a few heads at the office," he remarked, a slight chuckle in his voice, his glance lingering a little too long for comfort. Sarah tensed, her initial ease replaced by discomfort. She attempted to steer the conversation back to professional matters, mentioning a new marketing strategy she had been researching. Mr. Thomas briefly engaged with the topic, but soon redirected the conversation back to more personal matters. "You know, it's important to have a balance in life. All work and no play. You should go out more, enjoy life. Maybe we could explore some upcoming events together," he suggested, his tone suggesting more than a professional interest. Caught off guard and unsure how to respond without offending her boss or jeopardizing her position, Sarah felt her discomfort grow. She laughed nervously, trying to deflect the suggestion. "I think I keep a good balance, thank you. The marketing strategy for the next quarter is what I'm really focusing on right now," she replied, hoping to signal her desire to keep their relationship strictly professional. The rest of the drive was filled with an uncomfortable silence that hung heavily between them. Sarah sat staring out the window, feeling the weight of the situation. She was acutely aware of the precarious position Mr. Thomas's comments had put her in, caught between defending her boundaries and maintaining a cordial professional relationship. As they neared her home, she prepared herself to exit the car quickly, eager to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere and reflecting on how she might address this situation in the future without causing harm to her career. As the car moved through the quieter streets towards Sarah's home, Mr. Thomas's behavior escalated beyond uncomfortable comments. He reached over under the pretense of adjusting his seat, but instead placed his hand on Sarah's thigh. "You really are very talented, Sarah. I'm sure there are many ways you could advance in the company," he murmured, his tone implying a proposition that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah froze for a moment, her mind racing. This was no longer a subtle overstep of boundaries. It was an overt and inappropriate advance. Gathering her courage, she firmly removed his hand, pushing it away while keeping her voice as calm as possible. "Mr. Thomas, I appreciate my job and the opportunities at the company, but I think it's important to keep our relationship professional," she stated clearly, hoping to set a firm boundary without inciting a negative reaction. However, Mr. Thomas's demeanor changed almost instantly. His face hardened, and he withdrew his hand, but the damage to their rapport was palpable. "Of course, Sarah," he replied coldly, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "I would hate for your career to suffer because of a misunderstanding." The rest of the drive was tense, with Mr. Thomas's mood darkening. Sarah sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind reeling from the encounter. She was deeply uncomfortable and scared, not just of the potential repercussions for rebuffing her boss, but also of being alone in the car with him. She regretted not taking a taxi instead and promised herself to never be in such a vulnerable position again. As they finally arrived at her apartment building, Sarah couldn't get out of the car fast enough. "Thank you for the ride," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact as she opened the door. She didn't wait for a response, practically fleeing to the safety of her building. Once inside, she leaned against the door of her apartment, her heart pounding and her mind still processing the violation of her personal space and the subtle threats to her job. This incident was a clear abuse of power, and Sarah knew she had to take action, not only for her own safety and dignity, but to ensure that this behavior was addressed. However, the fear of potential job loss and professional repercussions loomed large. She needed a plan, support, and possibly legal advice. Tonight had shown her the darker side of her workplace dynamics, and she understood that navigating this would require careful thought and strong resolve. The feelings of violation and fear were overwhelming, but they also ignited a determination within her to stand up against such unacceptable behavior. After the car stopped, Mr. Thomas insisted on walking Sarah to her apartment door, claiming it was to ensure her safety at this late hour. His tone was persuasive, yet there was an underlying insistence that made Sarah uneasy. As they walked to the door, Mr. Thomas leaned in, speaking in a low, coercive tone about how helpful he could be to her career if she was willing to be more accommodating. His words were a thinly veiled quid pro quo, suggesting that her advancement in the company could depend on her personal favors to him. Sarah, feeling cornered and unsafe, responded with a firmness that surprised even her. "Mr. Thomas, I am very committed to my career and advancing based on my merits and hard work. I have no interest in any other kind of relationship beyond a professional one," she declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Her response was clear and assertive, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Mr. Thomas's face darkened at her words, his smile disappearing as he realized she was not going to be swayed. "You might reconsider, Sarah. It could be very beneficial for you," he retorted, his tone turning cold and threatening. His implication was clear. Her refusal could have negative consequences for her career. Sarah stood her ground, despite the fear that Mr. Thomas's words stirred within her. "I think it's best if you leave now," she said, her hand on her door handle, ready to enter the safety of her home. Mr. Thomas stared at her for a moment longer, his eyes hard and assessing, then turned sharply and walked away without another word. As she closed the door behind her, Sarah leaned against it, feeling the solidity of the barrier between herself and Mr. Thomas. She was safe for the moment, but the encounter left her shaken and worried about what the future might hold. The implications of rejecting her boss's advances were not lost on her. She knew that this could complicate her professional life. The gravity of the situation began to truly sink in. She was aware that Mr. Thomas was influential, not just in the company but in the industry. His support could indeed have been beneficial to her career, just as his displeasure could hinder it. Sarah knew that this was not just a personal issue. It was also a professional crisis. Faced with this realization, Sarah knew she needed to take action. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up against inappropriate behavior that no one should have to endure at their workplace. She decided to document everything that had happened tonight and started considering reaching out to someone in HR or consulting a lawyer to understand her options. Despite the risks, Sarah felt a resolve to not let this incident pass unchallenged, not just for her own sake but for the sake of others who might find themselves in a similar position. The morning after the troubling car ride with Mr. Thomas, Sarah felt the heavy burden of the incident pressing on her. The violation of her boundaries and the implied threats to her career had left her feeling vulnerable and angry, emotions that swirled chaotically as she prepared for work. As she stood in front of her mirror, trying to ready herself for the day, her reflection seemed to echo her inner turmoil. Throughout the day, Sarah found it hard to concentrate, her usual tasks becoming daunting as she replayed the previous night's events in her mind. The sense of isolation at work was palpable, as she wasn't sure who she could trust or turn to. During her lunch break, she reached out to a close friend not affiliated with her company, seeking advice and a sympathetic ear. Her friend listened intently, providing both comfort and practical advice. "You need to document everything," her friend suggested firmly. "Write down exactly what happened while it's fresh, and then we can look at what steps you can take next, legally and within the company." Empowered by her friend's support, Sarah spent the evening detailing every aspect of the encounter with Mr. Thomas. She noted the time, the subtle yet clear propositions, and his reactions to her refusals. With each word she wrote, she felt a small reclaiming of her power, transforming her feelings of victimization into action. Her friend had also advised her to look into the company's policies on sexual harassment and to prepare herself for the possibility of reporting to HR. The decision to take formal action did not come lightly. Sarah was acutely aware of the potential consequences, including retaliation from Mr. Thomas or being unofficially blacklisted in her industry. However, the thought of remaining silent, of allowing such behavior to go unchecked, was something she could not abide. If she didn't stand up for herself, who would? And how many others might suffer similar or worse if she stayed silent? The next day, Sarah contacted her company's HR department to inquire about the procedure for filing a complaint. She was met with a professional but somewhat guarded response. They scheduled a meeting to discuss her concerns in detail. As she hung up the phone, a mix of anxiety and resolve settled over her. She was stepping into uncharted territory, challenging a man who held significant power over her career. Yet she felt a growing conviction that this was not only about her, this was about justice, about ensuring a safer work environment for everyone. That evening, Sarah reviewed her documentation again, refining her notes and mentally preparing for the meeting with HR. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, possibly even painful, but she was determined to see it through. As she set her papers aside and prepared for bed, she felt an unexpected peace amidst the storm. Tomorrow she would speak her truth, and no matter the outcome, she would not back down. Entering the HR office, Sarah carried with her the comprehensive documentation of the incident with Mr. Thomas. As she presented her case, she was methodical, ensuring every detail of the encounter was clear and supported by her notes. The HR representative listened intently, taking notes and occasionally nodding in understanding. Sarah outlined not only the specifics of what had happened, but also expressed her concerns about the potential for retaliation and the impact this situation could have on her career. She emphasized the need for a fair investigation, hoping that the company would uphold its policies against harassment and protect her from any backlash. The HR representative assured her that the company took such complaints very seriously and that an investigation would be initiated immediately. They explained that the process would involve confidential interviews with potential witnesses and a review of Mr. Thomas's history within the company to determine if there had been other similar incidents. However, they also cautioned Sarah that the investigation could be lengthy and might require her to participate in multiple interviews and possibly confront Mr. Thomas, if necessary. While Sarah appreciated the thoroughness of the HR department's approach, the thought of a drawn-out investigation was daunting. She worried about the daily stress of working in an environment where her complaint might become common knowledge, potentially altering her relationships with colleagues. The HR representative sensed her anxiety and provided details of the company's policy on non-retaliation, reassuring her that any negative actions taken against her as a result of her complaint would be addressed seriously. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She was relieved that HR was taking her seriously, but anxious about the next steps. Would her actions help to bring about a positive change, or would they backfire, marking her as a troublemaker? Leaving the HR office, Sarah felt the weight of her decision. She knew she had done the right thing by speaking up, but the path ahead seemed fraught with personal and professional risks. Despite these fears, there was a part of her that felt empowered, bolstered by the knowledge that she had stood up for herself, and perhaps for others who might have been silent victims. As she walked back to her desk, Sarah resolved to stay strong and to closely monitor the progression of the investigation. She planned to keep detailed records of all interactions related to the case and to remain vigilant about her safety and reputation at work. The journey she had embarked on was not just about seeking justice for herself, but also about ensuring a safer workplace for everyone. This thought gave her a sense of purpose and a conviction to stand firm, no matter how challenging the road ahead might be. The days following Sarah's report to HR were tense and filled with quiet anxiety. In the office, she noticed the change in her colleagues' behavior towards her. Whispered conversations would stop as she approached, and there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Despite expecting some awkwardness, the reality of being potentially ostracized was unsettling and deeply uncomfortable. Sarah focused on maintaining her professionalism, making an extra effort to engage in her work and keep to her usual routine. However, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of scrutiny and speculation from her colleagues. Some seemed supportive, offering her small nods of encouragement or brief smiles of solidarity. Others avoided her gaze in conversations, perhaps wary of being dragged into the situation or of facing similar repercussions themselves. Amid this workplace tension, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. The lunches with colleagues that were once a daily ritual now became rare occurrences. She often found herself eating alone, using the time to catch up on work or to simply enjoy a few moments of solitude away from the whispering and glances. Despite the discomfort, Sarah remained resolved to see the investigation through. She regularly checked in with HR for updates, anxious to know how the investigation was progressing and how soon it might conclude. Each visit to the HR office was a reminder of the gravity of her situation, reinforcing both her fear and her determination. The investigation seemed to move slowly, with HR carefully gathering testimonies and evidence. Sarah was interviewed multiple times, each session probing deeper into her interactions with Mr. Thomas and the events of that night. These sessions were emotionally draining, forcing her to relive the discomfort and fear she had felt. Yet each time she reiterated her story with as much detail and consistency as she could muster, hoping it would lead to a fair outcome. During one of her follow-up meetings, HR informed her that they were taking her complaint seriously and that Mr. Thomas had been put on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. This news brought her a mixed sense of relief and apprehension. While it was reassuring to know that her complaint had resulted in concrete action, the reality of facing Mr. Thomas again, possibly in a disciplinary hearing or in a mediated session, was daunting. Throughout this period, Sarah also sought support outside of work. She talked regularly with her friend who had initially helped her decide to report the incident. These conversations were a lifeline, providing her with emotional support and practical advice. Additionally, Sarah began seeing a therapist to help her manage the stress and anxiety that the situation had caused. These therapy sessions became crucial, helping her to process her emotions healthily and maintain her mental health. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Sarah prepared herself for any outcome. She knew that regardless of the decision, her workplace dynamics might never return to what they were before, but she took solace in knowing that she had stood up for herself, potentially paving the way for a safer work environment for everyone at her company. Her resolve fortified her, readying her for the next chapter, whatever it might hold. The resolution of the investigation brought a complex mix of emotions for Sarah. When HR finally called her into the office to deliver the outcome, she felt a knot of apprehension in her stomach. The findings were clear, her claims were substantiated, and actions were being taken against Mr. Thomas. He would undergo mandatory sensitivity training and be transferred to another department where he would have no supervisory authority over her or any direct interaction with her. Sarah listened carefully as the HR representative explained the disciplinary actions, her mind processing each word with a mixture of relief and lingering concern. The fact that her experiences were validated by the investigation was a profound relief and a validation of her decision to speak up. However, the reality that the man who had harassed her was still employed at the same company was difficult to swallow. It underscored the complex, often unsatisfactory nature of dealing with workplace harassment. As she left the HR office, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, yet she knew that the full impact of her actions on her professional life was still unfolding. She returned to her desk to find several emails from colleagues. Some were messages of support, thanking her for her courage in speaking out. Others were more neutral, discussing ongoing projects as if nothing had happened. Each email was a reminder of the changed landscape she now navigated. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed small shifts in her workplace environment. Some colleagues seemed more cautious around her, perhaps wary of saying the wrong thing. Others approached her to quietly share their own stories of discomfort and inappropriate behavior in the workplace, which had previously gone unreported. These confessions were heartbreaking, but also formed a silent bond of solidarity among those who had faced similar challenges. Sarah's professional reputation, paradoxically, grew stronger in some circles. Her expertise and commitment to her job remained undisputed, and her bravery in standing up to inappropriate behavior added an unexpected layer of respect from many peers. Yet, she was not naive about the potential for subtle forms of retaliation or the long-term impact on her career trajectory within the company. Reflecting on her journey, Sarah realized that while the immediate crisis was resolved, the broader battle for a respectful and safe work environment was ongoing. She began to envision a future where she could apply her skills and experience in a setting that valued not only her contributions, but also her well-being. Her resolve to seek new opportunities was strengthened by her experiences, driven by a desire not just for personal advancement, but for an environment that aligned more closely with her values. Empowered by her newfound role as an advocate, not just for herself, but for others, Sarah started networking within her industry. Looking for companies known for their positive cultures and strong ethics, she engaged more actively in professional forums and discussions about workplace rights and women in leadership, using her story as a platform to promote change. As she prepared to close this chapter of her career, Sarah was more determined than ever to find a place where she could thrive without compromise. Her experience had taught her the importance of a supportive and respectful workplace, and had given her a new voice to advocate for those who still felt silenced.